Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of the podcast that I'm doing with Alessandro. In this series, we are diving into some of the psychology and behavioral elements of what makes marketing work. So, for those of you who are new to the podcast, my name is Simon Batchelor. I'm a marketing consultant and I've been running a marketing agency for 21 years. And last year, I also wrote a book called Reframing Marketing, which is all about how to do ethical and effective marketing. So, Alessandro, do you want to give us an intro as well?
Hello everyone, my name is Alessandro Calzolari and I help professionals like accountant, solicitor, coaches and consultants and tech companies to build the confidence of, for example, understanding who is the ideal client, what language the ideal client speak, but also why they should choose you as a professional or an expert. And this result in boosting your revenue, cut the marketing costs, and to be seen by your clients or prospects as the go-to expert.
So, today we're going to be talking about how to make content that resonates with your client's specific needs. So, Alessandro, do you want to start us off by giving us a few ways that you think we can make content that resonates with our ideal client?
Let's take a content or let's see a content as a vehicle to move from A, where the other person, the reader is, to B, where they want to be. So the content is the vehicle. And most of the time, we need to consider the content as like a journey. So rather than crafting content just for the sake of writing content, we need to really understand where the reader is in their buyer's journey. So the buyer's journey, the simplest way, we need to understand whether they know that they have a problem, whether they know there is a solution, that you can be the solution, whether or not they are ready to buy the solution, and the last part is whether or not they would suggest you as the solution to another friend or another colleague or buy something from you over and over. So when this is very, very clear in our mind when we craft content, there are different points of the content that we need to put more attention.
I think that's really interesting because those three elements, I guess, are the kind of underlying things that we need to get right in terms of creating content. And then it's about diving in, I guess, to sort of a deeper level of content in the sense of there are three things I think that work well with content. So one is making it actionable. So that's trying to make sure that your clients are able to do something with the content. I see this a lot, and this is calling back to what you said, where you're sort of making content for the sake of making content. And that really starts to show where it's like, well, actually, if you want your client to do something when they've watched or engaged with your content, then let them know what that is. So sometimes that can be just encourage them to interact. So ask a question, leave a comment, start that conversation. And for a lot of coaches and consultants, that's actually often the best thing to get clients to do, because you don't necessarily want to try and make content that's just about selling. So rather than saying, here's an interesting bit of content, also here's all my stuff to buy, and just give them a shopping list at the end, really the action is, well, here's where you can go to find out more. Or would you like to leave a comment? Or if you've got any questions, let me know. So I do this when I do my podcast episodes. I always say, if you have a question, you can find me on LinkedIn. I get lots of people find me on LinkedIn and say, hey, it said in your podcast that I can ask you a question. So here's a question. And it's great. I get lots of really good questions that then inspires more content for that audience. So is there any other factors there, Alessandro, that you think are important when you're making that content?
Yeah, so you mentioned like the call to action because most of the time we assume that the other person knows what they need to do next after having read our social media post. Where I see a lot of potential is when we match the written content with an image, the image that provide an emotion. We know that the power of an image compared to a piece of content, written content, is 10 times, 100 times much more powerful because that is going to also trigger an emotion. So the call to action, an image, and I would also say metaphors. I use a lot of metaphors because if I want to reduce the level of complexity for a concept, if I give a metaphor that everyone is familiar with, we can reduce the level of complexity and also make a piece of content more engaging.
Yes, I think that's really interesting because both images and metaphors are things that I think people really struggle with. So sometimes, if you're trying to explain an abstract concept with coaching or consulting, then people get to the end and they're like, well, I don't know what to make an image of. And I often think, well, if you get to the end and you don't know what to make an image of, then it means you probably haven't used a metaphor, because if you've used a metaphor, then you can use that as the image. So if you've said this is like a waterfall or this is like a vehicle, for example, then you can now make an image of that vehicle or that waterfall and relate it to that content. So I think that's always a good check, is like, well, if you don't know what to make the image of after you've written a blog or a web page, then you probably haven't described it in a very visual way or a simple enough way for the reader. So it can be a really good way of checking your own content.
Yes, and also in the call to action, the last part is to ask questions. I also ask questions because, for example, I see to move from A to B as the vehicle, but for someone else could be something else. So I can ask also questions to create this level of engagement.
Yeah, I think questions are a really good one. And also that's really good for, inspiring people to then engage with the post, leave comments or get in touch with a direct message or perhaps even an email. So, if we think about these different elements of content, then obviously what we're doing now is a good example of some content. We're having a conversation, we're talking about marketing psychology concepts, hopefully in a way that is engaging and easy to understand. So, obviously, this is one way of creating content with a podcast and a video of this content. And also, there's a written version of this same content as well that you'll find on LinkedIn. So, we've tried to capture all of the different learning styles there with the watch, read, listen, do. So, in terms of other forms of content, Alessandro, is there another form of content, or perhaps one that you find is working well for you?
If I start like the top one is the podcast, in particular, like the one that we are doing, because we can see the other person in terms of like maybe the facial expressions. If we want to create a trust, by using word, just word is really difficult. So when we see the other person, we can also learn from the body language, the facial expressions. So the podcast, or let's say even like a YouTube video, is very, very useful to create emotion, to bring a person on a journey. So podcast is my top one. A video is very, very effective. And then using images. So when I use images, as I described before, it's much easier to create an emotion. But the top one, if I need to choose, in fact, we chose like a podcast, is the best one because we start eliciting all the different senses. So the visual, the auditory, all the different triggers that we get from a podcast to a video, I think we can't get from a piece of content. So the top one, I would say podcast and a video.
I would agree with that. I find that the content I put out that's just written, I tried it for a little while, but it really doesn't get anywhere near as much traction or engagement as when I make videos in front of the camera. So I do content like this where I talk to someone and share an idea and a concept, and that's really good for building trust and helping explain concepts that it's useful for clients to understand before they work with you. So there's that element of it. But I also make content where I just talk to the camera. Now, what I'm actually doing is I'm basically reading my blog. So I've written the blog post and I'm reading that to the camera. Now, that works really well because I'm able to deliver that content to camera. And I know not everybody can do that. So for me, it works. But for some people, actually, that level or length of content just doesn't quite resonate with them. So I think that's where doing what we're doing, which is discussing and explaining to each other the different concepts, can really help sort of loosen up the flow and make it a lot more approachable and engaging for someone, rather than someone struggling through a video and trying to understand something and it feeling really labored and forced. I think actually this can be a really effective way of helping people just relax a bit into the topic, letting their expertise shine through without that pressure of it having to be perfect or feel presented.
Absolutely. And probably one of my biggest recurring questions is most clients ask me what is the type of content that I should use and what is the time. I would say try is an experimentation because sometimes you can create maybe a podcast. From the podcast you create an article, from an article a social media post. So you need to test what your audience prefer. And also the time. I can't tell you that this maybe Tuesday is better than Thursday, because your audience can be different compared to my audience and to someone else. So experimenting in terms of the type of content and the time is my biggest advice, because most people say, okay, now I have all the different concepts that you are say, I need to use the empathy, I need to use the vehicle, but what kind of content, what is the time? I can't tell you what is the right thing. I can share with you what I do and what I see in terms of conversation and consultation through content, written and visual content. But you need to try what works for your client or for your ideal client.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is the thing. It's like what works for one person might not work for another. And that's why I'm always very suspicious of people who are offering kind of one size fits all tactics. Another thing that I think I get asked is, what should I say in that content? How do I come up with the ideas for the content? And I think we've sort of mentioned it a couple of times in the different episodes. But actually, for me, it's all about finding those common questions that clients have. So if clients are often coming to you with a question, and you have to explain that during that first conversation you have, or if you're speaking to people at networking and a question comes up often or keeps coming up in slightly different ways, that's the content to start with. Just go for the really obvious stuff, top level. It doesn't have to go too deep, but just help people understand some of these concepts, ideas, or theories that help people understand more about the work you do and what working with you might be like. Because once they understand that theory from your point of view and you've helped them understand something, they're more likely to then come to you with further questions and want to keep that conversation going. So that's where content can be really powerful, I think, because it's not just sort of, chalk and talk. It's not just presenting one way. When it's done right, it can really help someone join two concepts together or think about something in a completely different angle, shift their perspective. And that can be really powerful for someone, especially if they then go on to do the rest of the work with you and go through the rest of the process and make the change that they seek to make. So, have you got any sort of closing thoughts for us, Alessandro, on the topic?
Yes, so linking to what you said in terms of a networking event where the recurring question can be a new topic. One way that I suggested at the beginning to use a call to action in terms of question. So when someone else is going to answer to your question on a social media post, you can take the answer and create a new social media post, because the answer can give you like some new fresh content that you didn't thought about that, but you can create like a sequence of maybe social media posts that allowed you to have always fresh content. So my biggest suggestion is to experiment and create this kind of engagement by asking questions, by listening, and trigger all the different emotion based on the type of content.
I think that's a really great idea. And I think that's a very good way of creating that content that's going to really resonate with your ideal client. So, if you've got any comments, do let us know. If you've got any questions, you can connect with us on LinkedIn. I'll put both of our LinkedIn profiles in the description of this episode. Thanks very much for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.